The old king stood alone in his golden palace chamber, holding a faded portrait of his late wife, tears streaming down his weathered face as he whispered, "How do I protect him from the wolves in silk clothing, my love?" King Edward had ruled the prosperous kingdom of Valoria for 30 years, but tonight, surrounded by marble columns and priceless tapestries, he felt more helpless than a beggar in the street. His only son, Prince Alexander, had come of age, and noble families from across the land were sending their daughters to the palace, each one more rehearsed than the last, their smiles painted on like the rouge on their cheeks, their kindness as temporary as morning dew. For weeks, King Edward had watched from behind curtains and through doorways as these ladies of high birth paraded through his halls, speaking words of honey to Alexander while treating the palace servants like furniture, stepping over the gardener's tools without a glance, snapping their fingers at the maids, and he saw through their performances like glass, knowing that whoever married his son would one day help rule this kingdom, would hold the welfare of thousands in her hands, and he would not let Valoria fall into the hands of someone whose heart was made of stone wrapped in velvet. That night, as the full moon cast silver shadows across his private study, King Edward made a decision that would have shocked his council of advisors and sent the royal court into chaos. He would leave the palace in secret, disguise himself as the lowliest of workers, and walk among his people to find a woman of true character. Someone who showed kindness when no crown was watching, someone worthy of his son and this kingdom. The next morning, before dawn broke over the kingdom, King Edward stood in the servants' quarters wearing clothes he had borrowed from the palace storage: rough brown trousers, a faded gray tunic, and worn boots that had seen more miles than most nobles traveled in a lifetime. His silver hair hidden beneath a simple cap, his royal rings locked away, his entire identity stripped down to just a man. And when he looked at his reflection in a cracked mirror, he barely recognized himself, which meant his plan might actually work. He left a sealed letter with his most trusted advisor, the elderly Marcus, explaining his plan and instructing him to tell Alexander only that the king had gone on a brief, spiritual retreat, and Marcus, who had served the crown for 40 years and loved Edward like a brother, embraced him with tears in his eyes and said, "Your Majesty, your late queen would be so proud of the father you've become." And those words carried King Edward through the secret palace passage and out into the waking streets of his capital city. For the first time in 3 decades, King Edward walked among his people, not as their ruler, but as their equal, and the experience struck him like a physical blow. The bakery owner's daughter, hauling heavy flour sacks before sunrise, her arms trembling with effort but her voice cheerful as she greeted neighbors. The old cobbler, already at work, repairing shoes with arthritic hands, charging prices so low he could barely feed himself. The mother of 3 sweeping the street in front of her modest home, singing softly to keep her spirits up despite the patches on her children's clothes. And Edward felt shame burn in his chest because he had believed he knew his people from his palace balcony. But he had known nothing at all. He approached the city's sanitation supervisor, a gruff man named Thomas with a scar across his chin, and asked for work, any work, saying he was new to the city and desperate to earn an honest living. And Thomas looked him up and down with skeptical eyes before finally saying, "We need someone to sweep the market district. Doesn't pay much, and the work is hard, but if you show up on time and do the job right, it's yours." And King Edward, who had commanded armies and signed international treaties, nodded humbly and said, "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." The market district was the heart of the capital, a sprawling maze of stalls and shops where merchants sold everything from fresh produce to handcrafted jewelry, where nobles rubbed shoulders with farmers, where the wealthy and the working class collided in a chaos of commerce and conversation. And it was here, with a wooden broom in his calloused hands, that King Edward began his education in humanity. The first day nearly broke him. His back screamed in agony from bending and sweeping. His hands blistered, despite a lifetime of swordsmanship training, and the way people looked through him, past him, as if he were invisible, cut deeper than any insult he'd received in the royal court. But he persisted, sweeping debris, emptying waste bins, cleaning up after careless shoppers who dropped their trash without a second thought. It was on the third day, while sweeping near a small bakery with blue shutters and the scent of fresh bread pouring from its windows, that King Edward first saw her, a young woman, perhaps 22 or 23, with flour dust in her dark hair and eyes the color of warm chestnuts, carrying a tray of bread to a homeless man sitting against a nearby wall. And Edward watched as she knelt beside the man, not just handing him the bread, but sitting with him, asking his name, listening to his story, touching his shoulder with such genuine compassion that the old beggar began to cry. Her name was Alina, he learned from the other street workers, and she ran the bakery with her aging father after her mother had passed away 2 years prior, working from before dawn until after dusk. Yet somehow, she always had time to pause, to see people, to offer a kind word or a free loaf to those who couldn't pay. And Edward found himself sweeping near her shop more often than necessary, watching her interactions, taking mental notes. One afternoon, a finely dressed lady from the noble quarter arrived at Elena's bakery in a carriage. Adorned with her family crested was Lady Cassandra, one of the women who had visited the palace to court Prince Alexander, all practiced smiles and elegant curtsies in the presence of royalty. Edward stopped sweeping to observe as Cassandra stepped down from her carriage, her silk dress swishing, her nose already wrinkled in distaste at the common market smells. Alina greeted her warmly. "Good afternoon, my lady. How may I serve you?" But Cassandra barely glanced at her, saying, "4 of your best pastries. And be quick about it. I haven't got all day to spend in this place," her tone dripping with contempt. And when Alina carefully wrapped the pastries and presented them with a genuine smile, Cassandra snatched the package, threw coins on the counter, without counting them properly. It was too little. Edward noticed and turned to leave, but as she did, she bumped into a small child, a street orphan with dirt on his face, and instead of apologizing, she recoiled, as if burned, saying, "Watch where you're going, you filthy creature. Don't you dare touch my dress." And the child stumbled backward, fear filling his eyes. Before Edward could intervene, Alina rushed from behind her counter, positioning herself between Cassandra and the child, her voice still respectful but firm, as she said, "My lady, he's just a child. He meant no harm. Let me offer you a cloth to wipe your dress." But Cassandra's face twisted with anger. "You dare speak to me that way? Do you know who I am? My family has connections to the royal palace itself. I could have this pathetic bakery shut down with a single word." And Elena's hands trembled slightly, but she stood her ground, gently guiding the frightened child behind her, saying quietly, "I apologize if I've offended you, my lady, but every person deserves basic kindness, regardless of their station." And Cassandra's laugh was cruel, as she said, "How naive! Kindness is a luxury for those who can afford it, girl. Something you clearly know nothing about." Before climbing back into her carriage and departing in a cloud of dust and indignation, Edward watched Alina kneel down to the child, checking him for injuries, offering him a sweet roll from her shop, telling him he was brave and good and worthy. And in that moment, the king felt something click into place in his heart. Here was a woman who had stood up to nobility, risked her livelihood to protect someone with no power, no influence, no ability to repay her. And he knew, he absolutely knew, that his search might be over. Over the following weeks, King Edward continued his work as a street sweeper. But now, with a focused purpose, he needed to know more about Alina, needed to test the consistency of her character, needed to be absolutely certain, because his son's happiness and his kingdom's future hung in the balance. He observed her helping an elderly merchant pack up a stall when the man's back gave out, saw her give her own lunch to a pregnant woman who looked faint with hunger, watched her stay up late into the night, baking extra bread to distribute to the homeless encampment on the city's edge. And every action confirmed what he already suspected: her kindness wasn't performance or strategy. It was simply who she was, as natural as breathing. One evening, as Edward swept the area near her closing bakery, Alina emerged, looking exhausted. Her shoulders sagged under invisible weight. And she noticed him, really noticed him, for the first time, saying, "You're the new street sweeper, aren't you? I've seen you working so hard these past weeks. Have you eaten today?" And Edward, caught off guard by her direct attention, stammered, I'm fine, miss. Thank you for asking." But Alina shook her head, disappearing back into her shop and returning with a meat pie, still warm, wrapped in cloth, pressing it into his hands despite his protests, saying no one should end their day hungry. "Sir, please, it's extra, and it would make me happy to know you're cared for." And Edward felt tears prick his eyes, because when was the last time someone had cared for him? Not King Edward, not His Majesty, but just him, just a person. And he managed to whisper, "You have a beautiful soul, young lady, truly beautiful." And Alina smiled, tired but genuine, before locking up her shop and heading home. That night, back in his secret room, in a boarding house near the market, King Edward wrote a letter to Marcus detailing everything he'd learned about Alina, instructing his advisor to quietly investigate her background for any information that might be relevant. And 3 days later, Marcus's reply arrived, via discreet courier. Elena's father, Robert, had once been a merchant of some success, but medical debts from his wife's long illness had consumed their savings, leaving them with just the small bakery. Alina had been briefly engaged to a merchant's son 2 years ago, but had broken the engagement when she discovered he was cruel to his workers. She had no scandals, no debts, no dark secrets, just a life of honest work and quiet generosity. The neighborhood spoke of her with universal affection and respect. She was, in Marcus's carefully chosen words, a woman of exceptional character who would honor any family blessed enough to call her their own. King Edward's hands shook as he read the letter, because he had found her, against all odds, in a kingdom of thousands. He had found the one woman he would trust with his son's heart and his people's welfare. But now came the difficult part. How did he arrange a meeting between Alina and Prince Alexander without revealing his own deception? And more importantly, how did he ensure that Alexander saw her true worth when she lacked the titles and dowries and political connections that everyone expected a future queen to possess? The solution came to him one morning as he swept near the palace district, observing the regular deliveries being made to the royal kitchens. The palace ordered bread from several bakeries across the city, but not from Elena's, and if he could arrange for her bakery to receive a royal contract, she would have legitimate reason to visit the palace, to potentially cross paths with Alexander, and nature could take its course. Using his knowledge of palace operations and a carefully worded anonymous letter slipped to the head chef, whom Edward knew was always seeking better quality at lower prices, Edward planted the seed that a small bakery in the blue-shuttered building near the central market produced the finest bread in the capital at the fairest prices, worth at least a trial order. And 2 weeks later, Edward watched with concealed joy as Alina received an official palace courier, delivering an invitation to submit samples of her baking for consideration as a royal supplier. Elena's face cycled through shock, disbelief, and pure joy as she read the letter, her father emerging from the back of the shop to ask what had happened. And when she told him, the old man embraced his daughter, both of them crying tears of gratitude because this contract could change everything, could lift them from the edge of poverty to stability, could be the blessing they'd prayed for. And Edward turned away from the scene, pretending to sweep, hiding his own emotional smile. The day Elena went to the palace, King Edward had already returned through the secret passage, cleaned himself up, resumed his royal identity, and positioned himself in the gardens where he knew Alexander spent his afternoons reading beneath the old oak tree. Prince Alexander was a thoughtful young man, tall and handsome with his mother's gentle eyes and his father's strong jaw, but sheltered, so sheltered, raised behind palace walls with tutors and guards and protocols, kind-hearted but naive about the real world. And as Edward approached his son, he said, "Alexander, I need to speak with you about something important." And the prince set down his book, giving his father his full attention. "I've been thinking about your future bride," Edward began, choosing his words carefully. "And I realize I've been approaching this all wrong. The ladies who've visited us, they've all been acting, performing the role they think we want to see. But that tells us nothing about who they really are, does it?" And Alexander nodded slowly, relief crossing his features as he admitted, "Father, I've felt the same way. They're all so polite and proper when you're watching. But I've heard how some of them speak to the servants when they think no one important is listening, and it troubles me." Edward's heart swelled with pride, because his son was wiser than he'd given him credit for, and he continued, "What if we judged potential matches not by their titles or rehearsed manners, but by their character, by how they treat people who can offer them nothing in return, by the content of their hearts rather than the size of their dowries?" And Alexander leaned forward, genuinely interested now, asking, "How would we do that, Father?" "Everyone becomes their best self in front of royalty. That's the challenge," Edward agreed. "But perhaps we could observe people when they don't know we're watching, or interact with them in situations where our identities aren't the focus starting today. Actually, there's a young baker coming to submit samples to our kitchen, and I thought you might participate in the tasting. Meet her as the prince. Yes, but in a casual setting. See how she carries herself, how she treats our staff, and most importantly, whether you feel any genuine connection." Alexander agreed, curiosity evident in his expression. And several hours later, Elena arrived at the palace gates, carrying a basket of her finest creations. Her simple dress, clean and modest, her flower-dusted hands scrubbed pink, her eyes wide with wonder at the magnificent palace she'd only ever seen from a distance. King Edward watched from a concealed balcony as Elena was led through the corridors, observing how she thanked every guard who opened the door for her, how she gasped with sincere delight at the paintings and tapestries, how she knelt to help a young servant girl who'd dropped a tray of linens, collecting the scattered cloths without any concern for her own dress. And when the flustered servant tried to apologize, Elena just smiled and said, "No harm done. We all need help sometimes, don't we?" And the servant girl looked at her as if she'd just met an angel. In the palace kitchen, Alexander was waiting, dressed in fine but not overly formal clothes. Introduced to Elena simply as Prince Alexander, without ceremony or fanfare, and Elena dropped into a curtsy so deep and awkward that she nearly lost her balance, stammering, "Why, Your Highness, I'm so honored. I never dreamed. I brought bread. I'm Elena. I bake bread. Obviously you can see that. I'm sorry. I'm nervous." And Alexander did something that surprised everyone in the kitchen. He laughed. Genuinely laughed, not at her, but with warmth, saying, "Please, stand up. There's no need for such formality. My father asked me to help evaluate some bakeries, and I'm told yours might be the best in the city. So really, the honor is mine. May I try your work?" Elena's nervousness eased slightly at his gentle tone, and she began unpacking her basket, explaining each item she'd brought: the honey wheat bread her mother had taught her to make, the cinnamon rolls she'd perfected over years of experimentation, the savory herb loaves she'd created, specifically thinking of palace dinners. And, as she talked about her baking, her passion and knowledge shone through, her hands moving expressively, her whole face lighting up. And Alexander found himself genuinely captivated, not by rehearsed charm, but by authentic enthusiasm. As they tasted each item, Alexander asked her questions. Where did she source her ingredients? How long had she been baking? What inspired her recipes? And Alina answered honestly, mentioning her mother's influence, her father's struggle, the satisfaction of feeding her community. And then Alexander asked a question that wasn't on any official list. What do you love most about your work? And Alina paused, really thinking before answering. I love that bread is essential, you know. Rich or poor, noble or common, everyone needs bread. And when I bake something that brings someone joy, or helps feed their family, or gives them comfort on a hard day, I feel like I'm doing something that matters, something real. And Alexander felt something shift in his chest, because he'd never heard anyone speak about their work with such purpose, such connection to something larger than themselves. The tasting concluded with the head chef declaring Elena's products exceptional and worthy of a palace contract. And Elena's joy was so pure, so unguarded, that everyone in the kitchen smiled. But as she prepared to leave, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Lady Cassandra had arrived for yet another social call on the prince, and she swept into the kitchen area, drawn by the sound of Alexander's voice, her eyes immediately narrowing when she saw him speaking with a common baker girl. Alexander, darling, Cassandra cooed, completely ignoring Elena's presence. I've been searching everywhere for you. Surely you're not wasting your time in the kitchens when we could be strolling through the gardens. And Alexander stiffened at her presumptuous tone and the word, darling. But before he could respond, Cassandra finally noticed Alina, and her expression curdled like spoiled milk. You're that bakery girl from the market, the one who was so rude to me. And Elena's face went pale as she said softly, my lady, I apologize if I offended you. I only meant, but Cassandra cut her off, turning to Alexander, Your Highness, you must be careful. These common girls, they'll latch onto any opportunity to rise above their station. She's probably using this bakery contract to scheme her way into the palace. You can't trust people like her. The kitchen went dead silent, every servant frozen in shock at Cassandra's cruel words, and Alexander's face transformed from polite neutrality to cold anger as he said, in a voice that suddenly carried every ounce of his royal authority, Lady Cassandra, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. But Cassandra, misreading his anger as directed at Alina, continued, I'm only trying to protect you from manipulators, my prince, people who don't understand their place. And Alexander stepped forward, positioning himself beside Alina in a gesture of solidarity that made King Edward, still watching from his hidden vantage point, want to cheer. Let me be absolutely clear, Alexander said, his voice cutting like a blade. Alina is here because her work is exceptional, and she's earned this opportunity through skill and dedication. While you, Lady Cassandra, are here because you've been pushing for my attention. Despite my obvious disinterest, I've now seen you treat people cruelly on multiple occasions, and I've heard reports of your behavior throughout the palace. So let me tell you what manipulation looks like. It's pretending to be kind and noble in front of the king, while showing your true, ugly character to everyone you consider beneath you. It's expecting special treatment because of your birth, while offering nothing of actual value. And it's mistaking a royal title for a free pass to demean other human beings. Cassandra's face went through several shades of red and white as she sputtered, How dare you speak to me? My family will hear about this. You'll regret. But Alexander cut her off. My father will hear about this directly from me, and I suspect he'll agree with my assessment. Now please leave the palace, and don't return without an official invitation. And Cassandra, realizing she'd catastrophically miscalculated, fled the kitchen in humiliated fury, her footsteps echoing down the marble corridors. In the aftermath, Alexander turned to Alina, who looked shell-shocked, and said gently, I apologize that you had to experience that. Are you all right? And Alina nodded slowly, finding her voice to say, Your Highness, you didn't have to defend me like that. I'm nobody important. And Alexander's response came without hesitation. You're a talented baker, a hard worker. And from what I just witnessed, someone with more grace under pressure than most nobles I know. That makes you very important. Elena, never let anyone tell you otherwise. From his hidden position, King Edward felt tears roll down his face because his son, his beloved Alexander, had just proven himself to be exactly the kind of man, the kind of king that Valoria needed, and more than that. Edward could see it in the way Alexander looked at Elena, in the way Elena's eyes met his son's with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. Something tentative but real. A connection was forming, authentic and unforced, exactly what he'd hoped for. Over the following months, Elena's bakery became the exclusive bread supplier to the palace, which meant regular deliveries. And King Edward, back in his street sweeper disguise during the days, watched with concealed delight as Alexander found reasons to be present during those deliveries, to help carry boxes, to discuss recipes, to simply talk with Elena about everything from baking to philosophy to dreams for the future. Alexander began visiting the market district, at first with guards, but eventually requesting to walk among his people more freely, and he sought out Elena's bakery, not as a prince seeking a subject, but as a young man drawn to a young woman's kindness, intelligence, and grounded wisdom. Elena, for her part, was initially overwhelmed by the prince's attention, but as she got to know Alexander, she saw past his title to the person beneath, someone genuinely curious about the world beyond palace walls, someone who listened more than he spoke, someone who treated her father with respect and helped her carry supplies without being asked, and cared deeply about making a positive difference in the kingdom he would someday rule. King Edward maintained his street sweeper disguise throughout this time, partly to continue his education in how his people truly lived, and partly because he enjoyed the anonymity, the freedom, the daily interactions with Elena, who still occasionally brought him extra food, never knowing she was feeding her future father-in-law, and the irony filled him with joy. 6 months after Elena's first palace visit, Alexander came to King Edward's private chambers, nervous and excited, saying, "Father, I need to talk to you about Elena." The baker and Edward set down his papers, giving his son his full attention, and Alexander continued, "I know she's not a noble. I know there's no political advantage to the match. I know the council will have objections, but father, she's the most remarkable person I've ever met. She's kind without agenda, wise beyond her education, strong in ways that have nothing to do with armies or power, and when I'm with her, I feel like the best version of myself. Like I could actually be the king our people deserve. I want to marry her, if you'll give your blessing." King Edward let a moment of silence hang between them, savoring this perfect culmination of his plan, before smiling broadly and saying, "Alexander, I give you not just my blessing but my wholehearted approval. In fact, I have a confession to make." And over the next hour, Edward revealed everything: his disguise, his time as a street sweeper, how he'd discovered Elena, tested her character, arranged her palace contract, all of it. And Alexander's reactions cycled from shock to disbelief to finally understanding and deep appreciation, as he said, "Father, that was either the craziest or the wisest thing you've ever done." And Edward replied, "Perhaps both, but it brought us to this moment, and I have no regrets." The wedding, 6 months later, was unlike any the kingdom had ever seen. Yes, there was royal pageantry and ceremony, but at Elena's request, the celebration was opened to all citizens. The palace gardens filled with common folk and nobles alike, and the feast included bread from Elena's bakery, distributed freely to anyone hungry. King Edward officiated the ceremony himself, and when he placed Elena's hand in Alexander's, he whispered to her, "Welcome to our family. Daughter, you've already made us better than we were." And Elena, radiant in a gown that managed to be both regal and somehow still perfectly her, whispered back, "Thank you, Your Majesty, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." At the reception, King Edward shocked the entire court by publicly revealing his months spent as a street sweeper, explaining his reasoning, the lessons he'd learned, and the changes he intended to implement in how the kingdom cared for its most vulnerable citizens. And while some nobles looked scandalized, the common people in attendance erupted in cheers, chanting their king's name with genuine love. Years later, when King Edward was truly old, his hair white as snow, his body finally slowing, he sat in the garden with his grandchildren and Elena's 3 children, who had inherited their mother's kindness and their father's thoughtfulness, and the youngest asked him, "Grandfather, why did you pretend to be poor?" And Edward lifted the child onto his lap, saying, "Because sometimes we can't see the truth when we're too high up. Little one, sometimes we need to come down to the ground, to walk in others' shoes, to sweep their streets, to understand that a person's worth has nothing to do with their crown or their coins. It's measured in how they treat people who can offer them nothing, in the kindness they give when no one important is watching. And your mother taught me that lesson better than any advisor or book ever could." Alina, now crowned princess and deeply loved by the people, overheard this from where she was tending to the roses, and she met her father-in-law's eyes across the garden, a look of mutual respect and affection passing between the king who had swept streets to find her, and the baker who had swept a prince off his feet simply by being herself. And in that moment, both knew that the kingdom was forever changed, not by conquest or wealth, but by the simple revolutionary act of choosing character over status, heart over heritage, and love over legacy.